Next up, we have our keynote speech by Ms. Gail Heriot. Ms. Gail Heriot is a law professor at the University of San Diego and a current member of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. She co-chaired the successful 1996 Yes on Proposition 209 campaign to outlaw race-based preferential treatment and the 2020 No on 16 campaign to prevent its repeal. Heriot currently chairs the No on ACA 7 campaign to prevent 209 from being undermined by unlimited exceptions. A prolific civil rights writer, she co-edited of A Dubious Expediency, How Race Preferences Damage Higher Education. Previously, she clerked for the Illinois Supreme Court and practiced the law in Chicago and Washington, D.C. Heriot holds a BA from Northwestern University and a JD from the University of Chicago. Let's welcome Ms. Gail Heriot.
Thank you, Swan. You know, the Asian American Coalition for Education held its first National Conference for Equal Rights back in 2019. 5 years later, here we are at the second National Conference. But it took a while, didn't it? It took a while. Of course, if Mike and the AACE had decided back in 2019 to make these conferences an annual event, it would have been impossible. You know, the next year, 2020, was the COVID lockdown year. But even if holding a conference had been possible, I fear it would not have been such a great idea because it would have been a real downer. So maybe it's just as well that we waited until this year. Think about it. Several months after the first national conference, the trial judge in the case of Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard had ruled very firmly in favor of Harvard University. A real disappointment, I know. By early 2020, trouble was brewing in my home state of California. Our state legislature was threatening to authorize a ballot measure that would repeal the part of the state constitution that prohibits preferential treatment based on race and ethnicity, not just in public education, the subject of our conference, but also in public employment and public contracting. To be frank, ladies and gentlemen, things looked rather grim in May and June of 2020. But a lot has changed since then, changed for the better. Of course, not every single thing that has happened has been good. I was disappointed, for example, that the Supreme Court did not take the Thomas Jefferson case. And from the look on Erin Wilcox's face, she was disappointed too. But you know, we all know how it is. In any political or social movement, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But never lose sight of the fact that 2 steps forward, 1 step back is actually a pretty darn good record. So don't ever lose sight of that. Our little citizen army, we are moving forward. And I dare say we will continue to move forward. Now, some of you may be saying to yourselves, why is she using the word army to describe us? We're not an army. We're not armed. We don't have weapons. Well, okay. I admit that we're not an army in the sense of guns and grenades. That's not our style. But in a more important sense, we are indeed armed. We are armed with the principle that all men and women are equal before the law, regardless of race or ethnicity. Never underestimate how powerful that is. Never. And precisely because we are armed with that principle, most of our fellow citizens view that principle as a core American value. And because we are armed with that principle, we have their support. Don't underestimate how powerful that makes us either. Our fellow Americans may not speak up in public as much as we might like them to, but they agree with us that race discrimination is wrong. They agree that individuals should be judged by their talents and abilities, and most importantly, by the content of their character, and not by their race or ethnicity. That means that our job is a lot easier than it might otherwise be, because when the public understands what the facts are, that is, when those facts are not being deliberately hidden from them, when they go to the ballot box, they're mostly with us, and that includes many citizens of every race and ethnicity. More and more politicians are finally figuring this out as well. You know, that's real progress for us. There are Democratic Party insiders like John Gies and Hubi Teixeira who are sounding the alarm. Their recent book, Where Have All the Democrats Gone?, warns Democratic leaders that their support for preferential treatment based on race and ethnicity has started to cost them a lot of votes. I wish we were a bigger army, and maybe we will be soon. But right now, it's funny, if you add up all the people who had the ability to devote significant energies to the cause of equal rights and education, it's not huge. Start with Edward Bloom and the attorneys at Consovoy McCarthy who litigated the students for fair admissions cases. They're a tiny, tiny, tiny group, all of them heroes in my book, very much including the late Will Consovoy, who worked so hard to bring those cases before the Supreme Court, but who died way too soon at the age of 48, just a few months before our victory in court. So God bless him. Even when you add the dozens of attorneys who contributed amicus briefs, like Lee Chang, like Devin Westhill, we're still not talking big numbers, ladies and gentlemen. I can't really fit them into my little red Honda Civic, but I bet I could fit the whole group into my garage. It's small. So let's add a few more heroes here. The students who were members of Students for Fair Admissions, especially those whose deposition was taken by Harvard. That took courage. And I've got some more heroes, some of them in the room here, like Wei Wah-chin and the Chinese American Citizens Alliance of Greater New York, fighting for equal treatment at Bronx Science and Stuyvesant, Azra Nomani and Citizens for TJ. And let me add my colleagues at Californians for Equal Rights Foundation, like Frank Hsu here, and the whole No on Prop 16 campaign, and most recently our No on AC7 campaign. Linda Yang at Washington Asians for Equality, and of course, Mike and AACE. So if you add those people together, and their organizations and the individuals and organizations that I have failed to mention, but should have mentioned, and I'm sure there are plenty of them, we're still not talking about a huge group of people. We're probably, past the hundreds now, maybe getting to 1,000 if we include everybody here. But out of a country of 330 million, that's still a tiny, tiny group. But that's okay. I think the distinguished anthropologist, Dr. Margaret Mead, got it right. She said, and I'm quoting her here, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. In fact, it's the only thing that ever has." So God bless all of you who have participated in this movement. Absolutely everyone. But let me get back now to the point of how much better things look now than they would have looked 4 years ago. And let me start with my own state of California. Back in the tumultuous month of June 2020, over our protests, the legislature did indeed put a referendum on the ballot that would have repealed the state constitution's prohibition on preferential treatment based on race or ethnicity. It was bad enough, ladies and gentlemen, that we couldn't persuade even one Democrat to vote against it. We couldn't even get all the Republicans to vote no. The panic over the death of George Floyd was causing our state leaders to lose all judgment. If Prop 16, as it was called, was adopted by the voters, it would have stripped the state constitution of these precious words, and I'm quoting here, "The state shall not discriminate against or grant preferential treatment to any individual or group on the basis of race, sex, color, ethnicity, or national origin in the operation of public employment, public education, or public contracting." Those words had been put there by a ballot initiative, that is a vote of the people, back in 1996, and they reflect our movement's core value today and an American core value, equal treatment under the law. That ballot initiative, as you might know, was called Proposition 209. As Swan mentioned, I had co-chaired the Prop 209 campaign way back then, so you can understand why I was willing to co-chair the No on Proposition 16 campaign. But the wonderful part is, in 2020, I was joined by a new generation of civil rights leaders, many of them immigrants from Asia or the children of immigrants, who come to this country precisely because of its fundamental principle of liberty and equality before the law. And they weren't going to allow the state of California to forsake those principles, not without a fight. Everyone told us back in 2020, we didn't have a chance. The only question was how badly we would lose. Because it was so obvious that we would lose, many otherwise sympathetic potential donors were unwilling to give us a nickel. Why waste money? Why risk being canceled? And as a result, our opponents had 14 times more money than we had. 14 times. We had small donations, $50, $100, but they had the $1 million donations. In addition, they had endorsements. Kamala Harris, Governor Gavin Newsom, Senator Dianne Feinstein, major sports teams even. And don't even ask about the mainstream media on this, ladies and gentlemen. Of California's major newspapers, only the Orange County Register, bless them again, had supported us. Some of the other newspapers, the Sacramento Bee, wouldn't even do us the courtesy of talking to us. But, miracle of miracles, it turned out that the money and the endorsements didn't matter. They had all the cool stuff, but we had the fundamental principle of equality before the law. That's what made us strong. We, the No on 16 volunteers, were relentless about getting the word out in any way we could. But once we got the word out, once people understood what was at stake, we had the voters. We defeated the repeal effort. It wasn't close. Even in deep blue California, over 57% of voters oppose preferential treatment based on race or sex. Let me just repeat it one more time in case you didn't hear. We were outspent more than 14-1, yet we still won. I can't tell you how proud I am of each and every volunteer and staff worker who helped us get the word out. But one of the things I've learned is that no victory is permanent. There's always more. And what can only be termed the zombie return of Proposition 16, the California legislature decided last year that it was going to try one more time to gut Proposition 209. These guys just can't give it a rest. I can't believe it, but they can't. While it's in the legislature, the new effort goes by the name Assembly Constitutional Amendment 7, or ACA 7. If it ever gets out of the legislature, it will get a proposition number and go on the ballot. It does not purport to be a straight repeal of the original Prop 209. Rather, it creates a procedure under which the governor can make exceptions, but don't be deceived. Don't be deceived here. While there are a few efforts in the text of ACA 7 to make it sound like the governor's authority will look limited, in fact, the governor will be able to grant any exception that his heart could possibly desire. ACA 7 passed the Assembly on strict party line back in the autumn. And my No on ACA 7 colleagues and I were told point blank by a member of the Senate back in January, this is going to pass. This is going to pass the Senate too. And her point was clear. She was trying to tell us we were wasting our time and we should just go away. But we refused to go away. We wrote op-eds. We sent hundreds of letters and emails, over 1,000, well over 1,000 postcards. We descended on the Senate office building with volunteers in our No on ACA 7 t-shirts. We talked to senators and staffers on that occasion. We distributed briefing books. We had local rallies. We even had hundreds of photographs just holding a little sign that says No on ACA 7 and then tweeting those off directly to the senators. We did a lot, but as of Thursday of this week, we won. Thursday was their deadline for getting this on the November ballot, and they were not able to do it. They backed off. They explicitly saying, they admitted, they were afraid they'd lose. There's a good reason they should be afraid they'd lose. So like maybe, just maybe, the third time is the charm. We succeeded in prohibiting preferential treatment based on race with Prop 209 back in 1996. We succeeded in defeating the repeal effort in 2020. And we succeeded again this year with ACA 7. But if it turns out that we have to do this a fourth, a fifth, sixth, and seventh time, then that's what we're going to do. That's what we have to do. That's what we will do. That brings me back to students for fair admissions versus Harvard. I believe that we got the strongest possible opinion from the Supreme Court. It is a huge breakthrough, ladies and gentlemen, well worth celebrating on its first anniversary. But it's worth pointing out that by my count, it was the 9th time that was the charm for the Supreme Court. There have been at least 9 efforts to get the Supreme Court to live up to the Constitution, the law, and to core American values. 9, count them, 9. The first case concerning affirmative action style race preferential admissions policies was actually not the Bakke case that people think of first. It was a case called DeFunis versus Odegaard. And it came before the court. I think the decision was in 1974, if I've got that right. So that's how far back these cases go. People always ask me, how far back have you been participating in these cases? And I can tell you, not that far back. I was like, I was in grade school at the time, so I missed that one. And the court actually decided not to decide it. That's what they did. And so what's interesting, though, about that original DeFunis case is who dissented, who said we should decide this case, we should make it clear that race discrimination is illegal and unconstitutional, no matter what race is involved. It wasn't the court's most conservative justice, not by far. It was actually Justice William O. Douglas, the justice that many people at the time would have thought of as the furthest to the left. And that shows you how times have changed in terms of the political makeup of all of this. The next opportunity for the Supreme Court to decide the issue was University of California Regents versus Bakke, which a lot of people have heard of. That's a case that even non-lawyers have often heard of. And it resulted in one of the most confused and fractured decisions the Supreme Court has ever rendered. 4 justices took the position that preferential treatment based on race was a rather obvious violation of the law. They thought that was an easy case. 4 went in the complete opposite direction. They wanted to give the University of California tons of discretion to do whatever they want. And one, Lewis Powell, the man in the middle, managed to write an opinion that technically, and for the immediate circumstances, gave Bakke the win. He was able to go to medical school, but it was on grounds that were so narrow, so unbelievably narrow, that any college or university could easily maneuver around them for all practical purposes, so they could do what they wanted with regard to preferential treatment. Interestingly, what sort of personality are we dealing with? Lewis Powell basically changed history with that opinion of his. He was so nice, he really was. He was the kind of guy that just didn't want to tell anybody no. And so that's what his opinion did. It said, well, we'll let Bakke win, but we'll let the University of California win too. You can't do that with fundamental constitutional rights. That's just it's not a great idea. One thing that many people don't know, he's often regarded among people who like preferential treatment based on race as a big hero. He'd been on the Richmond School Board earlier, when they were trying to implement Brown versus the Board of Education, and was anything but a civil rights hero there. Schools in Richmond did not desegregate when they should have, because Lewis Powell was a really nice person that didn't want to say to the people that wanted to keep Jim Crow laws in place. He wasn't willing to push back, and he wasn't willing to push back against the University of California. Anyway, after Bakke, colleges and universities knew that they could get away with just about anything, and they took full advantage. The Supreme Court refused to fix the mess that it had created when it declined to decide Hopwood versus Texas in 1996, cert denied, as they say. Smith versus University of Washington Law School, 2001, the court didn't want to take it. It finally took the two University of Michigan cases, Grutter versus Bollinger and Gratz versus Bollinger, and many people in this room, I think, had high hopes for that case, but no, didn't go. Basically, they decided it the same way the Bakke case had been decided. Then Fisher versus University of Texas comes before the court twice. Still, opportunity squandered. Finally, we get to last year with Students for Fair Admissions and our little citizen army. We've always been armed with the principle that all men and women are equal before the law, regardless of their race or ethnicity. We've really always had a lot of support from our fellow Americans, but now we are also armed with the Supreme Court decision. Already there are lawsuits being planned and filed that will be relying on that case. So are you ready for the bad news yet, ladies and gentlemen? It's not over. We cannot all go home after the celebratory dinner tonight and figure everything is just going to take care of itself. We're going to need a third conference, a fourth. You hear me, Mike? We gotta have a fourth and a sixth conference. We're gonna need state legislators willing to conduct oversight to ensure compliance with the court's decision. We're gonna need governors with the intestinal fortitude to appoint trustees to the boards of state universities who are willing to ensure compliance. We're going to need Freedom of Information Act requests to conduct our own investigations. We are going to need legislation at the state level to eliminate the bureaucracies that administer racial preferences. If we can swing it, there's some federal legislation I have in mind as well that I think will help. And we're going to need lawsuits, lots of lawsuits, I'm afraid. And we're going to need at the local level candidates for the school board and tennis shoes so that people can walk the precincts and make sure those school board candidates get elected. So not only can I not tell you that we're going to win every battle, I can't tell you for absolute certainty that we're even going to win the war, but I think we will. I'm pretty optimistic on this right now. The struggle for a free and just society is never won. The best that ever can be done is to pass the struggle on to future generations. But right now we have an excellent shot at passing on to future generations a freer and more just and better society than what we have right now. For me, it has truly been an honor to be part of this movement with you, but let's keep it going. We got a lot further to go, so thank you, ladies and gentlemen. way we always win, by being relentless. We figured with ACA 7, 2/3 of the legislature is necessary in order to put something on the ballot for a constitutional amendment. There are 40 senators, 8 of them are Republicans, and they were easy this time. They learned their lesson from Prop 16, so they weren't terrified anymore. Let me say, just again, nothing makes me more annoyed than a terrified Republican, I mean, for goodness sake. So that meant all we needed was 8 Democrats. And although we were getting signals from some of the more progressive senators that like, this is gonna pass, nevertheless, the ones in Orange County were vulnerable electorally. So we didn't bother with arguments from principle. We argued, their safety. We argued, 1, this is not going to pass, so you're gonna look back. Number 2, if it does pass, most of the things that you're trying to get done here are going to be found unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. Number 3, you are alienating Asian American voters who worked hard to defeat Prop 16, and we could show them statistics about how the Asian vote is decreasing for Democrats over time. And then we could argue that California is a weird state. It is deep blue. We cannot, tell them, somebody, a Republican will be elected governor. It's not going to happen. But what we could tell them is that although California is a deep blue state, and it's going to remain a deep blue state for a long time, the congressional districts are drawn in such a way that there are many very close districts, and that, as you might know, U.S. House of Representatives is very close. And so we don't know with this election whether the House of Representatives is going to be in Republican or Democratic hands. But one way to put it in Republican hands would be to put things like this on the ballot, which will bring out voters, particularly Asian American voters, who were the more conservative Asian American voters. And so that was something they had to think long and hard about. There were a couple of them who were in districts who would have been threatened individually for their re-election. And the one who was quickest to tell us, I'm not voting for this, was one who knew very well that if he came out in favor of it, it would hurt his chances at election. He was actually running for Congress, and he was not an idiot and realized he had to be with us. And that's basically how I think it happened. Of course, they don't tell me everything about what's going on in their minds, but judging from the actions here, they waited until the last minute to assign it to committee. I think they actually made their decision months ago that they were not going to let this go through, and that was a leadership decision. And so I think that's a leadership decision based on the knowledge that it is probably not going to pass, and instead the negative consequences of permanently alienating voters was going to be a big problem for them, including possibly the congressional election issue. And what we had to do was simply keep telling them, here's how much we won Prop 16 by. Also, the part about funding, I think, is important because we had our fundraising actually in some ways was the most marvelous thing you've ever seen for Prop 16. Not many campaigns get $50 and $100 donations on that epic a scale, and Frank Hsu is responsible for that. He did a terrific job. But we didn't get the big donations, that they literally were getting $1 million donations for the Yes on 16 side, and we didn't have anything that was even remotely like that. But now, they saw that we won. And I probably shouldn't name names here, but we're like the veterans of St. Crispin's Day now to some of these donors. They're thinking like, gosh, we missed out giving significant money to the No on 16 side. And we did have donors who didn't have to do it because it never went on the ballot. But we'd have been better funded the second time. We never would have been funded as well as the Yes on 16 side. But we'd have done better this year with large donations because we won before, and that helps.
Yeah, maybe I need a lesson about American politics 101, but can you explain the dynamics between the voters' will and the party line? Because if Proposition 16 was so easily defeated, why they were going it again? Wouldn't they risk losing their seats? And it sounds like that maybe playing out some defeat, but why are they going it at all? Is it because towing the party lines more important for the political career?
I think that their donor base won't tolerate this sort of thing, and that matters to them. I think that while most voters are on our side, most voters who are on our side, this is not the issue that's at the top of their list. And so if it's not at the top of their list, they may still vote for the incumbent who voted in favor of Prop 16, or who, had they had the opportunity, voted in favor of ACS 7. So both those things are important. The fact that this is an issue that is very important to the progressive major donor donors, and that when it comes to how close to the top of your list is this when you're deciding who to vote for, a lot of the people who are on our side, nevertheless, this isn't what they think of first when they go and decide on which candidate to go for. Part of that is because we should be working harder on informing them. I think many people believe that the preferences that the elite universities were giving and admissions were just a little feather on the scale. Womp! No, it's not at all, and it hasn't been. I mean, there was never a time that it was just a tiny thing. It was always a large preference. You look back at the numbers in the Bakke case, huge preferences were being given, huge. And people just don't know that. They don't know about it. Yes, sir.
Yeah, just a couple of comments, and thank you for your works and over the 2 decades and this and the works. Thank you, California, and I'm living in California. I know that that's very important. And I think the ACA 7 will come back in 2 years. We can see, and those Democrats, the progressive, they will never give up. So that's why we need to continue to fight it, and we're working together. But in the meantime, I also decided that I also want to give the credit to the California political rights, the organizations, and the Chinese American Civil Action and others, and the students for fair admissions. And also, for this is the bills, and California Republican Party is very supportive of the decline, and let's give them a credit as well. Thank you.
Anybody else? Yes.
I think most of us here are first generation immigrant. We have kids in college or graduate from college already. I really admire that you fight for this equal education opportunity for all people, especially in California. So how do you encourage, or as second generation, we have to admit, I think more than 70% or more of our second generation kids has been go through public school, and their brain turns to the left and the left and the left. So how do you
You put your finger on a real problem here, and it's an interesting problem, and I guess I would have to defer to Mike Gonzalez on this, where he was telling us about how his kids come home and he has to sort of re-educate them. It's real work, it's real work to have to ask, starting in kindergarten, what'd you learn today? And if it's not good, at some point you got to pull your kids out and find a better school. But if it's slight, you just, you work against it. You say, that's not what we believe in this family. And it's very difficult. But it's something that parents everywhere and grandparents have to really focus on, because it is true that they do not teach, for example, they do not teach about communism in this country. That from the time of the 1950s, it has been considered sort of rude to talk about that in that way. And we need much better education about what life is like in countries that have been under various sorts of dictatorships, including communism, And it's hugely important, hugely important. I am shocked at the number of people that I run into who have never heard of the Cultural Revolution, much less know exactly what it is. I'm thinking that at some point we're going to have to start institutions that teach people about what American values are and what the history of places that haven't had those values have been, and how easy it is for any country to forsake its values and end up going down the wrong road. So that's the best I can do on that. You put your finger on a problem that is huge and worries me all the time. Yes.
Yeah, so Gail, along the same lines as what was just brought up, Gail, it's occurred to me for a number of years, right? Because I've been fighting for equal access to educational opportunities for a while. That there's a huge irony that we spend all this time fighting for the rights of our children to go to colleges where we have the privilege of paying $100,000 a year if they're private, to have them brainwashed, right? And I failed in that respect. I have 2 kids going to private colleges right now. There's nothing I could do to talk them out of it. But the one thing I would recommend right now is that Asian American parents and parents across America who are concerned about the brainwashing going on at a lot of these colleges, where 90+% of professors are self-admitted progressives, right? Where there's no real diversity of ideology or thought, is that we open our own minds about what a good college is, right? Instead of following rankings on US News and World Report, and just telling our kids that the only colleges we're going to are the ones in the top 20. And we look at schools like University of Austin, we look at schools like Hillsdale College, that from a very young age we tell our kids that they should be considering schools where governors, in states like Florida or Texas or other in the South, where the faculty is not as hopelessly one-sided. But that's a possible solution that's market-driven. People with talented kids send them to other colleges that are not top-ranked, and over time, the rankings will change.
I agree with that. Also, it's worth pointing out here that the colleges are about to enter into a period of time where they are not going to be able to find as many students as they used to have. They're going to have financial problems. Somehow, we've got to be able to leverage that into persuading some of these schools to offer something different. And of course, we've got Hillsdale, we're now getting the University of Austin, but we're going to need a lot more than that. And we're not going to be able to build all these schools from the ground up. We're going to have to get some schools that decide that they want to go out of their way to be more politically balanced. It'll be hard to get a large university to suddenly become conservative, but we need to be working on this over the next decade or so. Yes.
Thank you for your great work in California. And so my question is, instead of defending year after year in this war, how do we attack?
How do we attack? Okay. Well, Prop 209 initially was an attack since we went forward, but we pretty much covered the states that have a popular initiative. What I would very much like to do, but it's going to require a different Congress than what we have now. I want to make it impossible for accreditors to pressure schools into engaging in more preferential treatment than they would otherwise. I've been on the faculty now for like 35 years at the University of San Diego, and we've had situations where we had quite a few faculty members that wanted to, don't do this, don't discriminate on the basis of race. But the argument that was thrown back at us is our accreditor is requiring this, and that ends up silencing the people that want to do the right thing. And so we need to get the accreditors off the backs of these schools, and that will help a little. It's not a cure-all, but there is no cure-all. The only thing we can do is take every situation that we can and try to make things a little bit better. Try to look for where the incentives are coming from. And right now, that's one of the places. Another thing that I think is clearly unconstitutional, and I am trying to work on putting together a lawsuit, there are federal programs that shovel money to schools that can say, we have at least, and the most important one is the Hispanic Serving Institutions Program. If you've got at least 25% Hispanic students, you get money that you wouldn't otherwise get. Well, if a school has 21%, they're gonna go nuts to get themselves to 25%. And so they do. I think that especially after the Students for Fair Admissions decision, that's a program that we can find a court that will deal fairly with. I'm pretty confident we can win a case that it is unconstitutional. But the hard part is setting up the case, finding the party that has standing. And if you've been following recent Supreme Court decisions, the Supreme Court is very careful about the standing issue. So we have to find the right plaintiff and then bring an action. Alternatively, if we had a president, a House, and a Senate, it could be done by legislation, but so far we don't have that. So we're working on it. And you know, it's important that we keep moving, that we keep those red states that do have strong legislatures. We need to make sure they look into the bureaucracies of the state universities and stop them from spending as much money as they do to fund jobs for people whose whole purpose is to thwart us and to thwart the Supreme Court's decision.
Thank you.